As the sun blazed down on June 28, 1778, the fields of Monmouth, New Jersey, were about to host one of the most grueling showdowns of the Revolutionary War. Picture this. It's hot, humid, and both armies are marching right into one of the longest, deadliest fights of the entire war. The British forces under Sir Henry Clinton had just evacuated Philadelphia and were heading back to New York City. The Continental Army, under George Washington, saw an opportunity to strike as the Redcoats marched along, weighed down by supply wagons stretching for miles. Now, Washington wasn't just going to let them walk away untouched. This was the moment to show the British that the Continental Army, now tougher and trained by the legendary Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge, wasn't the ragtag group they once were. With all the pieces set, Washington sent General Charles Lee ahead to lead an assault on the British rear guard, a chance to hit them while they were vulnerable. But what was supposed to be a surprise attack quickly turned into one chaotic, sweltering, brutal mess. Washington knew this battle could be the one to finally show the British that the Continental Army was no pushover, and he put General Lee, who was not exactly thrilled about it, in charge of the attack. You see, Lee wasn't a fan of Washington's battle plan, doubting the Continental Army's ability to handle the British in a full-scale engagement. Lee's skepticism grew out of a lack of confidence in both his troops and in the plan itself. But orders were orders, so he grudgingly moved forward. At the crack of dawn on June 28, Lee and his troops approached the British rear guard, but instead of executing Washington's bold vision of an ambush, Lee hesitated. That hesitation was all the British needed. Clinton's men began counterattacking, and Lee's troops, instead of digging in, began falling back, a retreat that quickly turned into a full-on disorderly retreat. This was where Washington, with his characteristic timing, made an unforgettable entrance. When he heard that Lee was retreating, Washington galloped forward, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. Imagine seeing your commander roll in, dust kicking up behind him, and he's just furious. Washington confronted Lee in a now famous, intense exchange that likely involved a few choice words. But there was no time to waste. Washington had to rally his panicking troops immediately. Taking charge, Washington reformed his lines on the spot. He rode up and down the ranks, encouraging his soldiers to hold steady. His very presence was a stabilizing force, transforming the chaos into a determined stand. With new confidence, the Continental soldiers dug in for a brutal fight as the British forces closed in. Now, this wasn't just any summer day, it was scorching. Temperatures reportedly soared over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and soldiers on both sides were dropping from heat exhaustion. The heat was as much an enemy as the musket fire. The men were drenched in sweat, their uniforms clinging to them, barely able to lift their muskets. In some cases, soldiers succumbed to the heat right there on the battlefield, falling without a single wound. Amidst this inferno, artillery and musket fire filled the air as both sides clashed. The Continental Army held their ground against the British assaults in a series of brutal exchanges. Every advance was met with musket volleys, cannon blasts, and a relentless determination to not give an inch. Washington's army, hardened by Valley Forge, displayed discipline and tenacity, matching the British blow for blow. This was a stark contrast to the previous year, when Continental forces had often broken ranks under British pressure. One of the most enduring legends from Monmouth is the story of Molly Pitcher. As the story goes, a woman named Mary Ludwig Hays was on the battlefield, bringing water to soldiers collapsing from the heat. When her husband, a gunner, was struck down, she reportedly took his place at the cannon, loading and firing alongside the men. Molly Pitcher became a symbol of the grit and bravery displayed at Monmouth, embodying the spirit of those who fought regardless of their role. Though historians still debate the full details of her story, Molly Pitcher has become an iconic figure representing the resilience and courage of those who stood up against overwhelming odds, even in the face of impossible conditions. As the sun started to dip, both sides were exhausted, neither able to claim a decisive victory. The battlefield was littered with fallen soldiers, equipment, and the scars of a day-long struggle. The British, realizing that they couldn't break the American lines, finally began their withdrawal under cover of night, slipping away towards Sandy Hook to continue their march to New York. For the British, This wasn't the kind of battle they were used to. They had engaged with the Americans, expecting to break their will, only to face an opponent who had stood their ground with ferocity and discipline. The Continental Army had proven that it could go toe-to-toe with the British Army in open combat, a morale boost that resonated throughout the ranks. While the Battle of Monmouth ended in a technical draw, its significance went beyond mere tactical victories. Washington's handling of the battle, from his intervention to rallying the troops to the sheer resilience shown by his men, was a testament to the progress the Continental Army had made since the bleak winter at Valley Forge. The British were left with little choice but to regroup and retreat, signaling a shift in the war's momentum. News of the battle spread, and for the first time, European observers began to see the American forces as a legitimate army, capable of holding its own. Monmouth became a symbol of American endurance and resolve. Washington's leadership during the battle reinforced his standing as the leader who could bring the colonies to victory. As for General Charles Lee, his actions at Monmouth didn't go unpunished. He was court-martialed for his failure to execute Washington's orders and for the chaos that ensued under his watch. It was a hard fall from grace, and Lee's reputation never fully recovered. The Battle of Monmouth was more than just a clash in the heat. It was the Continental Army's coming-of-age moment. The soldiers who fought that day, many of whom had endured Valley Forge, proved they could match the British in open-field combat. They had evolved from a scattered group of volunteers into a disciplined fighting force, and while the British might have been able to march away from Monmouth, they couldn't shake the reality that the Americans weren't backing down. In the end, the Battle of Monmouth stood as a testament to the grit, endurance, and leadership that would carry the Continental Army through the Revolution. The British were no longer facing untrained militias, but an army with resolve. And with Washington at the helm, they had no intention of giving up the fight for independence.